Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for more people to get logged on and then we will begin. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Stephanie from Explorica. I'm the history specialist here. Welcome to our webinar. We are very excited tonight to have Dr. Kyle Falcon present on spiritualism, psychic phenomena, and the Great War. This webinar will be recorded, so if you want to share it with your students or your colleagues afterwards, we'll be sending you a link on how you can do that. And if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat, and we will let Kyle know that you have some questions for him. So without further ado, Kyle, please take it away.
Okay, and you can hear me okay? All right. So thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me here tonight to talk about spiritualism, psychic phenomena, and the Great War. Now, I'm often asked how I first got interested in this topic, and it was actually in 2008 during an undergrad classroom. We were reading the memoir of a Canadian soldier named Will R. Bird. And as the story goes, in 1917, Will R. Bird was on the Western Front just shortly after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and he's sleeping in a shelter with two other soldiers. And he's awoken in the early morning hours by a tug at his arm. And he looks up and he sees his brother, Steve Bird, standing in front of him. Now, Steve should not have been there because he actually went missing in 1915. His body was never found, so he was presumed killed. And so Will's very confused. He's excited. He keeps asking his brother, you know, what happened to you? Why didn't you tell us you were still alive? And his brother doesn't say anything. He just lifts him out of the trenches and kind of proceeds to walk away. And Will starts chasing him. Eventually, he loses sight of him, looks around for a little while before kind of chalking the whole thing off to a hallucination or a waking dream. And he falls asleep among some ruins. And he's awoken several hours later to frantic cries from his comrades. And they explained to him that the shelter that he had been sleeping in that night had been hit by a shell, and the other two men had been killed. All they could find were some loose body parts. And they presumed that Will R. Bird had been killed too, and so they're surprised to see that he had made it out of the bivvy alive before it had been hit by a shell. And so Will R. Bird attributes his survival to the ghost of his brother, who saved him from certain death in the First World War. And immediately I was interested and perplexed by this story. It didn't seem to fit with me with what I had thought about the First World War. The First World War is kind of a quintessential modern war. It's the first modern industrial conflict. It's the first war involving tanks, the first war involving airplanes. It's a submarine war. It's a gas war. 75% of the men who die in the First World War die from either artillery or machine gun fire. And so it seemed kind of odd to me, this supernatural element amongst this modern scientific and technological war. And in Canada, we tend to talk about the First World War, I think, in two ways. The first is the idea that the war is essential to the formation of a Canadian national identity, with the Battle of Vimy Ridge at the center. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917, kind of marking the birth of Canada as a nation. Now, the problem with this narrative is that half of all those who fight for the Canadian Expeditionary Force were born in Britain. They're British-born subjects. They're not born in Canada. And even those Anglican Canadians who were born in Canada considered themselves to be British subjects first and then Canadians. And it's only over the course of many decades, as the generations who experienced the First World War, who fought in the First World War, start to pass away and their memories start to fade from living memory, that it becomes easier for this myth of the Vimy myth of the birth of a nation, of national identity formation, to really dominate the way we talk about the First World War. And so tonight, I'm going to emphasize the British imperial nature of Canada's First World War experience. And so I'm going to be jumping back and forth from British and Canadian examples. And one reason for that is because the phenomenon that I'm talking about today was, in a very significant sense, a British export, produced first in Britain and then exported to Canada in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I also think it's important to drop kind of the national identity myth, the Vimy myth, because I want to emphasize the importance of death and grief to the experience of the Great War. Because this, unlike the Vimy myth, this was a universal, not a national experience. It was mass death and bereavement, which largely shaped the ways in which both Canadians and Britons remembered the war in the 1920s. 900,000 men died from the British Empire between 1914 and 1918, and a similar number are left permanently disabled. So there's hardly a community or family that is not touched by the war's psychological trauma. And much energy is spent in the 1920s and 1930s trying to make sense of this industrialized slaughter. And this leads to kind of the second dominant myth of the war, and that is the myth of futility and disillusionment or disenchantment. And according to this myth, Canadians and Britons greet the war with enthusiasm. After rushing to enlist, soldiers discover the horrific nature of trench warfare. They're led to the slaughter by incompetent generals and ignorant home front. And those who survive are either physically or mentally scarred. And society as a whole comes out of the war feeling disillusioned about the war's purpose, but whether it's really worth it. And this narrative, I think, has been so powerful, thanks in part to the endurance of the Great War's writers, those who I read growing up in school: Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, the Great War's poets, the novelists. And in Sassoon's trilogy of novels, for example, the protagonist, George Shurston, first arrives at the front imagining that the Great War's dead are in a state of splendor and glory in the afterlife. And this image is quickly shattered when he arrives in the trenches. And when ghosts reappear in Sassoon's later writings, they are mutilated and grotesque figures that kind of stand in as metaphors for Sassoon's trauma. So, for example, while he's convalescing in Fourth London Hospital and suffering from shell shock, Sassoon writes in his diary how he witnesses the floor become, quote, littered with parcels of dead flesh and bones, faces glaring at the ceiling, faces turned to the floor, hands clutching a neck or belly, a livid grinning face with bristly mustache peering at me over the edge of my bed, their hands clutching my sheets. But when he awakes the next morning, there's no blood on his sheets or on the floor. And while the Great War's poets are well known, I think lesser known is that Sassoon's mother attempted to contact the ghost of her son, Amos Sassoon, with the Ouija board. That Robert Graves saw the ghost of one of his comrades on the battlefield, or that Wilfred Owen's brother, Harold, saw Wilfred's apparition halfway around the world at the precise moment of his death. And so it is this side of the war that I want to talk about today, one in which soldiers and their families found the war to be an enchanting, not a disenchanting experience. On the battlefield, soldiers had premonitions and attributed their survival to angelic, psychical, or spiritual protection. On the home front, people flocked to seances, experimented with telepathy, and saw the ghosts of their loved ones in dreams and in photographs. This was all part of a general surge in interest towards the movements of spiritualism and psychical research. Now, what do I mean by spiritualism? Well, spiritualism can broadly be defined as the belief in the survival of the human personality after death and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead, particularly through the seance. Its origins are usually traced back to 1848 in upstate New York, but it takes off in Europe and North America in the 1850s in the form of a parlor game. And it's in simplest form, participants placed their hands around a small table and proceeded to ask a series of yes or no questions. And if the table moved twice, then that usually indicated a yes. And if it moved once or not at all, that indicated a no. Now, if you wanted to get more complicated messages, you would rehearse the alphabet. So you would say A, B, C, D. And if the table moved at D, you knew the first letter was D, and then you would proceed through the process until you got the full word. Say you wanted to know a spirit's name or something like that. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because this is the impetus behind the idea of the Ouija board. So in the 1880s, the practice is simplified with the creation of what were called talking boards. And later, towards the turn of the century, the first commercial Ouija boards. But there was other ways that spiritualism manifested itself. So probably the most complex or complicated was spirit photography. And in this method, clients would first sit with the medium, usually hymns or prayers would be recited, and then the client would then be photographed. And after the plates were developed, a spirit face would emerge floating above. You can see some examples here. And I'll come back to this. But by far the most preferred method were seances, in which a medium, who was usually always a woman, would enter into a trance. Participants would hold hands around a table, and then the medium would kind of directly channel the spirits, and you could actually have a one-on-one dialogue with the spirits. And over time, seances became quite complex, and mediums started to produce physical phenomenon. So musical instruments would be played from a distance. Objects would materialize on a table. Mediums would levitate. Some mediums even reported to be able to manifest an embodied spirit that would basically come out of the medium's body, and it would look like a ghost, and it would walk around the table and even interact with some of the participants. And after these types of seances, mediums were found with a strange substance, which was called ectoplasm. You can see an example here on the right. Now, in reality, this was later discovered to just be cheesecloth. But spiritualists believe that it was actually the physical trace of the spirit. So once the spirit left the medium's body, what was left of its kind of physical entity or physical existence would exude out of the medium's mouth or sometimes out of the body. And they labeled this ectoplasm. And it's in this context that spiritualism actually gains the attention of some of the most renowned scientists. So notable spiritualists included the co-discoverer of natural selection, Sir Alfred Russel Wallace, the discoverer of the element thallium, Sir William Crookes, and even Nobel Prize winners such as the French physiologist Charles Richet. Even Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie, Thomas Huxley, Charles Darwin, they didn't believe in spiritualism per se, but they still attended seances. If you were a scientist in the 19th century, At one point or another, you were drawn to the seance just out of curiosity's sake, or just because some of your scientific friends were interested in it. And there's two reasons for this scientific interest in the subject. The first is theological. So in the latter half of the 19th centuries, discoveries in biology, such as Charles Darwin's theory for natural selection, geological discoveries, right, dating the age of trees, of stone, of the earth, and things like biblical criticism, all of these are beginning to challenge traditional Christian interpretations of the origin of life, of the evolution of life, of the nature of man and the cosmos. And so a significant portion of learned men and women, those who were educated on scientific and religious matters, begin to experience basically a crisis of faith. And they turn to spiritualism as an alternative or sometimes a complement to their Christian faith. In the seance room, the afterlife and psychic activity could be demonstrated, observed, tested, and sometimes even touched, right? Seeing was believing to them. You didn't have to rely on faith or scripture. And towards the end of the 19th century, actual spiritual churches begin sprouting up in Britain and North America, where practitioners could go to hear a sermon about spiritual or psychic matters, mingle with like-minded individuals, and even engage in a seance or two. The second reason for scientific interest in spiritualism was more technological. So at the turn of the century, discoveries using kind of the manipulation of electromagnetic fields. This is a very exciting time for modern physics. It's the birth of modern physics. Discovering invisible forces and fields like electricity, like magnetic radiation, that could, although invisible, could be manipulated with and could actually shrink time and space. So you have technological inventions such as wireless telegraphy, the telephone, X-rays, radio waves, and this leads people to reimagine what was possible. It stimulates a kind of creativity and pushes the boundaries of what could be possible. And if you could communicate with someone through wireless telegraphy halfway across the world, what's to say that our minds can communicate with each other, that thoughts didn't travel across waves or fields, just like kind of physical particles did? Or maybe the distance between life and death was merely a communication problem waiting to be solved by the next brilliant mind. And so this stimulates a scientific interest. It wasn't just about religious fears or a crisis of faith. And so it's in this context in 1882 that a group of Cambridge intellectuals in the UK found the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR for short. And their goal is precisely to test various hypotheses regarding the latest claims of spiritualists and try to uncover a physical and scientific reality behind this phenomenon. It bodes a very prestigious membership. Famous members of the SPR included Sigmund Freud, the father of American psychology, William James, and the British physicist Sir Oliver Lodge, who actually was key in inventing the radio. Now, the SPR does exist today. It doesn't hold quite the prestigious membership it once did. It's not as popular as it once was, but it has left a significant cultural impact in probably a way you never noticed before. In fact, that it's actually the SPR that coins the term telepathy. In their 2-volume book, Phantasms of the Living, the SPR sets out their case for the telepathy's scientific existence. This is their great big project. They believe that telepathy is real and that they can prove it scientifically. And they do this in 2 ways. The first is through card reading experiments. So through a series of trials, basically you would have somebody looking at cards, thinking about the contents of a card, and then somebody sitting across from them who couldn't see the card's contents would then have to guess what was behind that card. And the SPR concluded that the number of correct answers exceeded chance, that it wasn't just lucky guesses, that people actually were telepathically communicating with each other. But the second, more curious line of evidence came from the public. So the SPR requests documentation of strange experiences and it receives tens of thousands of supernatural experiences from across the British Empire. And what they discovered was that those within the British Empire were prone to experiencing a very certain type of ghost, what they labeled crisis apparitions. And in a crisis apparition, an individual's ghost would spontaneously appear to someone at a distance and coincide with a moment of crisis, such as injury or death. So, for example, while he was still at home in Saskatchewan working on the harvest in 1915, Will R. Bird actually claimed to see the fleeting ghost of his brother, Steve Bird, for the first time. It only lasted a second, but he saw his brother there in the fields of Saskatchewan in soldier's uniform. And he later discovered that this was at the same day that Steve was missing and presumed killed. And so what the SPR concludes is that phenomena like this, these crisis apparitions, they're not ghosts in the traditional sense. They're not actually spirits, but they're actually a form of telepathy. And so according to their theory, what happens was that during a moment of crisis, such as death, the individual who's dying sends a message to their loved ones. It comes out of their subconscious, travels across space, travels across time, and it's received by the subconscious of somebody who they are very close to, who they have this very sympathetic and affectionate relationship with. And from there, it kind of lingers in the subconscious until somebody either falls asleep or is in a state that's prone to hallucinations or waking dreaming. And from there, the message is basically translated into something more concrete, an image, a hallucination or a dream. So one example that's shared by the historian Martha Hanna in her new book that I found quite striking was that of a Montreal war wife who wakes up at 2 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of April, 1916, to the voice of her husband calling her name. She hears her husband's voice. And her family members are soon awoken by her cries out for her husband, who's supposed to be fighting in France. And they come into the room and they don't see anything and they don't know why she's freaking out. But 11 days later, she received a telegram notifying her that her husband did indeed die on the 16th of April, the same day that she has this auditory hallucination. And so the SPR receives plenty of cases like this during the war. And basically the theory is in a case like that, the woman's husband is dying and he wants to let her know that he has died. And she wakes up in the middle of the night and she receives the message from her subconscious in the form of an auditory hallucination. Now, I think we can appreciate the value of such experiences or the significance of such experiences to the people who experience them when we remember that this is a very global war. Families, especially in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, India, right? The British Commonwealth is vast, it spans several continents. Families are suddenly separated from one another by thousands of miles and suddenly placed into harm's way. And this leads to a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. Letters would be used to relay news to and from the front. And in the absence of physical touch or proximity, letters also take on sort of mystical quality as a means of sustaining affection between the front or the home front and battlefields. But the slow passage of mail across the dangerous submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic Ocean also meant that many Canadians learned of major battles days and sometimes weeks, sometimes even months before receiving a letter from a loved one that would confirm they were alive, or if they were dead, an official telegraph from the War Office that confirmed their death. So you would read something in the papers about a big battle. You didn't know if your husband was in it. And if you didn't receive a letter for 2 or 3 weeks because of the delay, your mind instantly went to those horrible thoughts that your loved one was dead. As one soldier wrote about his wife back in Canada, "What it must be, this waiting and waiting and hoping against hope each day that all will be well. A man out here knows what is going on and does not have to worry, but for those at home, it is one long uncertainty." And when news of death was received, it was always dry, the language was always dry and depersonalized. But telepathy, however, offered immediacy and intimacy. there was a reassurance that in his last moments alive, the soldier was able to communicate with their loved ones and inform them of their passing. And some people who believed in psychic phenomenon even experimented with telepathy during the war. One British woman named Olive Field tried to establish a telepathic bond with her husband at the front. At 9 p.m. every night, the two thought of each other intently. Olive hoped that if a bond could be established and the worst should happen, her husband would be able to send her a crisis apparition informing her of his death. There were even tools sold on the home front designed to help establish telepathic bonds. The so-called yoga agency sold yoga crystals, warning that telepathic messages may linger in the subconscious undetected. As their advertisements noted, a thought wave intensified by the knowledge of the instant severing of the ties of love and relationship can transcend time and space. A yoga crystal will help you to develop and read this message. But it was through seances and mediums that spiritualism became most popular during the war. So in 1916, the British physicist Oliver Lodge publishes his book, Raymond or Life and Death, and it presented evidence that mediums had been in touch with the spirit of his youngest son, Raymond Lodge, killed at the front in 1915. The book is an international bestseller, including in Canada, and it inspired a new genre of books documenting spirit communications from fallen soldiers, including L. Kelway Bamber's Claude's book, Walter Wynn's Rupert Lives, and Ellen Little's Grenadier Wolf, among many others. It is also in 1916 that the author of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, announced that spiritualism was, quote, the greatest religious event since the death of Christ. In the 1920s, he spread the cause through a dozen books, countless newspaper columns, and lectures across the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. In 1922, he presented to a crowd of 3,000 at Toronto's Massey Hall. According to Conan Doyle, the soldiers of the First World War had died in order to prove the existence of the afterlife. Acting as both religious prophets and cosmic scientists, they were capable of imparting new revelations that could unite science and religion and end intellectual, social, and human conflict. Inspired by Lodge and Conan Doyle, many begin to flock during the war and after to seances to try their hand at spiritualism, many of whom lost a loved one in the war. But what was said in these seances? Well, unlike the grotesque and mutilated figures that haunt Siegfried Sassoon, the ghosts that haunted the home front in seances across the British Empire were happy, uplifting, and positive. Spirits assured their loved ones that they died quickly, instantaneously, and spent no time suffering. The spirits also professed to be living in a state of splendor and paradise. The spirit of one soldier explained, I am in a wonderful and glorious zone. My home now is far lovelier, far more beautiful, far more wonderful than I have ever or could have ever imagined. This realm is perfection itself. This vision of paradise offered an escape from war's material destruction and a safe haven for loved ones brutally killed in the conflict. Britons and Canadians were not ignorant of the brutal realities of the First World War. Family members received letters from the soldiers detailing horrific and gruesome sights. And after the war, the disabled came home without limbs or with disfigured faces. But through consoling messages like this, one could rest assured knowing that a family member was free and safe from the horrible dangers of war. The surge in interest in spiritualism must be seen in part as a reaction to the shocking nature of death in the Great War, how people died and what happened to their bodies. The war made conventional death rituals impossible and encouraged experimentation with less orthodox means. The Imperial War Graves Commission, for example, is founded during the war to bury and commemorate all of the British Empire's war dead, and they proclaim an equality of treatment. All bodies were to be buried on the site on which they had fallen on the battlefields and given the same modest headstone. You can see here an example of what a typical Commonwealth war grave cemetery, well, not a typical, this is actually the largest, but what these cemeteries look like. All the gravestones are exactly the same. And this was precisely designed to prevent wealthy families from either repatriating the bodies of their loved ones or erecting expensive tombstones that overshadowed the rank and file. And what I like to say to my students is if you want to get a sense of just how unusual this was, how big of a shock it must have been to Britons and Canadians who were used to kind of more extravagant memorials, all you have to do is go walk through your a local cemetery, and you can instantly see which families came from status and wealth. And if you look at some of the very large tombstones that kind of overshadow all the others, chances are that those people were born either in the late Victorian period or the late 19th century. Now, Britons could travel across the Channel to visit graves on occasion, but this privilege was only available to the more affluent members of Canadian society who could afford the journey across the Atlantic. Most people were not given the opportunity to travel to France to visit the gravesite of their loved one. The war also occurs at the moment that Britons and Canadians are unaccustomed to the death of their children. In 1870, the death rates for English and Welsh males aged 5 to 19 was 19.3 per 1,000. But by 1900, that number had declined to 10.2. Now, we don't have the same national statistics for Canada, but there's good reason to suspect that the numbers were similar. A survey of infant and child deaths in Toronto, for example, found that between 1870 and 1874, 1,079 infants and children died, but between 1895 and 1899, that number was only 459. So that's more than a decrease of 50%. Oliver Lodge had 12 children, Conan Doyle had 5. All of them lived to adulthood, and Raymond Lodge and Kingsley Conan Doyle were the first of their children to die, and both in the war. So it's a shock when suddenly 900,000 young men are killed over only 4 years. The war also makes other conventional mourning practices impossible. In the immediate days following death, it was customary to lay the dead body out for a viewing. This allowed the bereaved to confront the fact of death. But half of the British Empire's war dead have no known grave. Bodies were either eviscerated by shell fire or swallowed by the earth during successive artillery bombardments. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which was the successor to the Imperial War Graves
Oh, hi everyone. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Just bear with us and hopefully we'll be back online in a minute.
respond to death. And I don't think that it's any surprise that people gravitate to something that's different or unusual, such as spiritualism. And without a body, soldiers are perpetually missing. So many people on the home front had to rely on eyewitness accounts or simply the passage of time to determine if their loved one was alive. And so some never give up hope that their husband or son might turn up in a French hospital or a German POW camp. And this leads to a potentially endless mourning. And it's hard, I think, to overestimate the psychological trauma that the war's missing had on those on the home front. They literally and metaphorically haunt the British Empire. Phantom faces, my favorite example of this is spirit photography. So phantom faces of unidentified soldiers appear in countless spirit photographs that are taken in the 1920s in Britain. And these are published in the press or put on display in the public in the hopes that the public could identify these missing soldiers as their loved one or as a friend who passed in the war, as kind of this way to try and connect those who are grieving with these missing soldiers.
Oh, hi,
And
Kyle.
just as affluent members of Canadian society traveled to France to visit the grave of a loved one, we also have examples of affluent Canadians traveling to Britain in order to get their photo taken with a famous British spirit photographer. There were no spirit photographers in Canada, but there were two very famous ones in the UK, and Canadians who had the means actually traveled to Britain to get their photograph taken.
Hi, Kyle. If I could
And
just
the
interrupt real quick. We can't see your slides.
Oh,
I just wanted to let you know. Sorry.
yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Just trying to find a good time to pop in.
Good now?
It's still showing your notes.
Oh, geez. Now?
Yeah, we can see them now. Great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so the amount of missing results in a viable market for mediums. So people, for example, the author, Rudyard Kipling, the author of the Jungle Book, his son John goes missing in 1915, and he receives countless unsolicited messages from mediums who claim to know where his son's body is and what happened to him. And now sometimes we do have cases where this results in accurate predictions, but it also results in false predictions. And probably my favorite is that of gunner George Smedley of the 87th Siege Battery, who receives a frantic letter from his wife in February 1917. A medium had informed her that her husband was killed, but a very much alive Smedley wrote back to his wife advising her to stop attending seances. And as Smedley's case indicates, soldiers were well aware that those on the home front were engaging in seances, and sometimes it became the target of satire. So the Canadian Trench newspaper of the 14th Canadians, the RMR Growler, included a fictional seance between Mary and the spirit of her husband, John. Are you happy, Mary? Oh, very happy, Mary. Are you happier than when you were on Earth with me, John? Oh, yes, Mary, much happier. Why? Where were you? I'm in hell, Mary. Spiritualists also served at the front. For example, Harold Erith of the 86th Canadian Battalion identified as a spiritualist on his attestation paper. Popular spiritualist journals such as Light and the Two Worlds were sent to the front, and soldiers also read Lodge's book Raymond or attended seances while on leave in England. Now, does this mean that there were seances on the battlefield? Well, I have looked and I have looked and I have looked, and I have found nothing. It's unlikely because for two reasons. One, most mediums tended to be women. and mediumship was regarded as a feminist or feminine occupation. The constant roar of the guns and the demands of life on the line would also have made it difficult to concentrate on things like trance. Nevertheless, a couple examples can be found. Colonel Percy Fawcett of the British Sixth Corps used a Ouija board to try and discover the locations of German batteries. He was relieved of his duties when word got out that he was relying on the occult arts instead of military intelligence. Away from the Western Front, a group of sailors aboard the HMS Cordelia formed a spiritualist circle and began conducting seances shortly after the Battle of Jutland. If spiritualist practices were rare on the front, a number of the soldiers nevertheless reported spiritual experiences. Death on the Western Front was random and impersonal. Usually, it came from an artillery shell or a machine gun bullet, which could drop from the sky at a moment's notice or ricochet off of an object, killing some but leaving others miraculously unscathed. In such an environment, supernatural explanations and superstitions flourished. Soldiers carried lucky charms or placed Bibles in their tunics to protect themselves against bullets. Sometimes these Bibles did indeed save a soldier's life, as in the lucky case of John Dickinson. But more frequently, chaplains tragically reported finding fully pierced Bibles among a dead soldier's possessions. Others resorted to prayer in moments of danger, even if they were not religious in everyday life. One soldier wrote home that, "I could hear them getting closer and closer. It was then that something like a miracle happened. A thought came into my mind which seemed to fill my very soul. It is all right, they are praying for me at home." Then the explosions passed further away and eventually stopped for a time. With that, my chap came back to where I was and said, "Did you see those three?" When I asked him what three, he said he had watched 3 shells in succession fall within a few yards of us, and none of them had exploded. By far the most frequent reported supernatural phenomenon was premonitions. Premonitions of impending death can be found amongst all participating nations, as well across the ranks, including high-ranking officials. While commanding the Canadian 1st Division at Passchendaele, Lieutenant General Cameron MacDonald was with General Plumer when he thought he heard a voice state, "Ronald Morrison has been killed." MacDonald turned to Plumer. "Did you hear that, sir?" Plumer was perplexed. He had not heard anything. MacDonald later learned that Morrison had been fatally hit by a shell. Some soldiers even managed to convince themselves that they were psychic. One Canadian private recalled that a comrade had accurately predicted on 2 separate consecutive occasions who was next to be killed in their unit. He eventually earned the nickname Hoodoo Bill and was hounded by men to reveal who would be next. But he refused to engage in further prognostications and became so anxious that, according to one soldier, his nerves got the better of him and he was taken out of the line. The battlefield, therefore, much like the home front, could also serve as a site of psychic activity, in which spiritual and psychic laws revealed themselves. I want to be careful and make sure that I'm not trying to say that any sort of supernatural phenomenon or any supernatural or superstitious beliefs should be labeled as spiritualist or as part of psychical research movement. But these movements, spiritualism and psychical research, were very much interested in the various supernatural and paranormal happenings that were occurring on the front, publishing dozens of these stories in their journals and books as confirmation that the war was part of a grand cosmic plan. This image of the war fits awkwardly within our contemporary memory of the conflict. But for a significant section of the British Empire, spiritualism and psychical research offered a modern and scientific religion that adapted nicely to the industrial and technological warfare of the Western Front, as well as what people were experiencing at home. Telepathy, seances, spirits, and psychics coexisted amongst artillery, gas, machine guns, and tanks. Siegfried Sassoon's grotesque and mutilated ghosts have survived in our cultural memory. But a century ago, very different ghosts haunted the home front and battlefields. Perhaps the war was not so disenchanting after all. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle.
No
We
problem.
have
Sorry about the room had got very dark. One of my lamps must have gone off. Sorry about that.
We have a few questions, if you don't mind. The first one we have here says, it may be outside of your purview, but you link the rise of psychic phenomenon with the rise of techno-utopianism, which came as a result of the new inventions like the telephone. Could a similar phenomenon have emerged as a result of the space race and nuclear power? In other words, could the techno-utopianism and anxiety of the 50s be what led to UFO sightings?
Yeah, that's a very great point, and people have researched this and written about this. But absolutely, it's interesting that the first UFOs are actually spotted or become a cultural phenomenon in the Second World War, when air power is such an important part of modern conflict. Foo Fighters is the label they gave them. But yeah, absolutely, I would say there is definite continuity, and nuclear physics also opens up strange new doors for people to believe in things like telekinesis. There's that movie, I forget the name of it, The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is based loosely on a true story about the CIA investigating paranormal phenomenon. So these things change in kind of their form and content as technology and cultures change, but there's definitely a continuity to both, yeah.
Great. We have a couple more questions here that are popping up. The first is, someone else asked, have there been any modern photos with spirit faces showing?
No, spirit photography, I mean, it's funny, the more cameras we have in our possession, the less these things seem to be a thing. Spirit photography really fades away after the 1930s as cameras become easier to use. I mean, these photos were produced using, like glass plates. You had to be trained on how to take photos and develop them. It was a skill. And so that kind of left the door open for kind of these different manipulations, ways of producing kind of these spirit faces. Once like film cameras become more of a thing, you do kind of get some stuff, but it's mostly things like orbs, which people believe are just basically particles of dust reflecting off of light. But that's when orbs become a thing. And since kind of the information age, I mean, you get a lot of Photoshop stuff, kind of a lot of urban legends, but not this kind of intense interest in the possibility of photographing ghosts. There's more interest in things like white noise or certain sounds that can be picked up by only certain images. But spirit photography really is kind of has come and gone, I think.
Interesting. And the next question we have, was there anything similar after World War II? Did seances go through another resurgence?
Yeah, so they do. Not to the same extent. There's a lot of reasons for that. But after the Second World War, there is a similar kind of uptick in interest. But it doesn't have kind of this sacred element to it. So in the 1920s and 30s, there's just so much effort by people like Conan Doyle to kind of redeem the war by saying that spiritualism proves the afterlife, it can unite science and religion, and we have 900,000 dead to thank their sacrifice to thank for this revelation. Once the Second World War breaks out, that kind of language is less powerful and less potent. But the Second World War was seen as its cause was a lot more obvious to a lot of people. whereas the First World War was a bit more ambiguous. What was it about? What was it for? Why did we fight it? It required or stimulated more interest in kind of cosmic explanations, whereas in the Second World War, the explanations were quite obvious, especially as France is invaded and Britain is bombed with the Blitz. So it does seem an uptick, but just not to the same energy. And just one more reason I think would be there's not as many missing in the Second World War as there is in the First. So the First World War is just, there's just so many missing bodies. It's one of the first things students notice when they travel to the cemeteries at France, just how many soldiers' bodies are unidentified. So it's complex. There's a lot of reasons. It still did exist, but not to the same extent.
And the last question we have here, someone would like to know if you in fact own your own Ouija board.
I have never used a Ouija board, and people are always surprised when I say that. I don't know why. I just have never. I have never used one. I think people don't believe me when I say I'm really just not that interested in whether or not these things are true or false. I'm just much more interested in why people believe in them and how and why these things come about. So I've never actually used one, but hopefully someday.
Perfect. Well, I think that is the last of our questions. We want to thank you very much. This was very informative, extremely interesting. And to all our viewers, we will have a video recording of this available for you so you can share it with your students, any other faculty at your school, or anyone you might think would be interested. And yeah, we just want to thank you very, very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Great. Well, have a great evening, everyone. And thanks again to Dr. Kyle Falcon.
Thank you.
Good night.